1 Timothy chapter 2. 1 Timothy chapter 2. The Apostle Paul's writing a letter to his long-trusted friend and protege, Timothy. Now, for those of you who aren't part of our Sunday night service, again, the message got flipped this morning. Timothy is serving as the pastor of the church at Ephesus. Now, I sent out a presentation for you guys. You could look at page 2 if you like. Page 2 kind of gives you a general map of, I believe it's Paul's third missionary journey, and that's kind of modern-day Turkey that you're going to see. And page 3 is just kind of zooming in a little bit, and I believe I have an arrow pointing to this, a black arrow pointing to the city of Ephesus right there on the Aegean Sea. So for those of you who have been part of our Sunday night service, you've seen this. This is nothing new to you. For those of you who haven't been part of that service, maybe this is a first look for you. But Ephesus is a church over on the western shores of Asia Minor. It's called Asia on that map, Asia Minor, which is kind of like the western portion of modern-day Turkey. Timothy's there, serving as the pastor. All this happens after Paul leaves, after the end of Acts. So Paul's placed in prison in Caesarea, in Jerusalem and in Caesarea, and he goes to Rome. And after he's released, he goes back to Ephesus. And we don't read about this in Acts, but he leaves Timothy there in Ephesus, and he goes over to Macedonia, which isn't on your map. It's on the other side of your map, if I understand, if I remember. But he leaves Timothy there to be the pastor of this church, and this church, Ephesus, is not an easy place to be a pastor. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15:32 that he fought wild beasts at Ephesus. And so far, Paul taught Timothy to protect the church from false doctrine. That's one of the key truths that a pastor really needs to be committed to, is to protect the church from false doctrine. Timothy needs to defend the faith in the midst of false doctrine. He needs to expose false teachers. We looked at that a couple weeks ago. And he needs to warn the church about those who would harm it. Those perhaps outside the church who would harm it, even those who try to creep into the church and try to harm it. Now, at this point in the letter, Paul moves on to gathered worship. How should men and women behave in the local church? What type of leaders should they have? That is, like, what type of pastors? What type of deacons? What should Timothy's priorities be as a pastor? How should Timothy handle widows in a local congregation? These are the types of things that we're going to look at for pretty much the rest of this letter, 1 Timothy. Last Sunday night, we looked at Paul's call for men to pray as part of corporate worship. Men are to pray for those in authority, not rebel against them. Men are to submit to those in authority, not resist them. Men are to pray that believers can live in peace, not participate in violence. They're to pray for the salvation of the lost. They're to pray without anger and dissension, which leads to things like division. We're seeing that in this country right now, big time. We're seeing division. We're seeing anger. We're seeing wrath. We're seeing dissension. Paul calls men in the church, believers, to pray for those in authority so that we may live a tranquil and peaceful life, a quiet and peaceful life as believers, so that we could spread the gospel. That's our mission. I know a lot of Christians like to take up political causes. We do that. We get sidetracked with political. Our mission is the gospel, not politics. So that's what Paul writes about men, and we looked at that last week. But what about women? What about women? We're actually going to spend the next 2 weeks talking about women. How should women handle the gatherings of the church? Today, Paul writes about that very subject, and he starts by saying, in principle, saying that godliness is more important than looks. Did you hear that, guys? Godliness, I'm saying that to the men, all right? Men who are I don't know if we have any men we have a few men who are of dateable age. but to the women as well, godliness is more important than looks. Paul writes that women should not excessively focus on their appearance. Look at 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 9. Likewise, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly garments. Now, Paul recognizes that men will sometimes have anger problems, and he wrote about that in the last paragraph. He also recognizes here that women can have an unhealthy focus on their outward appearance. And it could go both ways, by the way, which we'll talk about. Women can become overly obsessed with being glamorous. Paul tells the women to, quote, to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly. That is, there's an appropriate way to dress, and there's an inappropriate way to dress. Does that make sense, guys? There's an appropriate way to dress, and there are actually sinful ways to dress. Did you guys know that? I'm sure most of you probably knew that, right? There are sinful ways to dress. In the New Testament times, that would mean something a little different than it does today. The modesty problems we have in America today weren't common in New Testament times. That is, women weren't walking around in short mini skirts. They weren't exposing their breasts to the world around them, unless, of course, they were prostitutes. Prostitutes did expose certain parts of their body, although ancient prostitutes didn't dress nearly as scantily as many American women dress in Walmart. I've been quarantining, for the most, but most of you guys, and listen, you guys get it, right? Nobody gets within 15 feet of me for the most part, unless you're teasing and you want me to run away. But I haven't really gone anywhere. I had to go to Walmart last week, and wow, that was something. It was a reminder of where we are as a culture a little bit. Today, women will dress the way ancient prostitutes dressed. I mean, that's just a fact. I don't know what to say about it. And then they'll wonder why they're treated as sex objects. They're treated like sex objects because they're telling the world that they are sex objects. Many women today are entirely hypocritical in this area. If you dress, listen to this, if you dress like a prostitute, don't be surprised when you get treated like one. And this should absolutely not happen in churches. When we gather for worship, and that's what this paragraph's about, when believers gather for worship, this type of thing should not happen. There should be modesty. Now, in my house, when our television's on, now we have some rules about the television. I don't like the TV really being on before 8 o'clock at night. Okay. I don't like the TV's not on if everyone didn't read their Bible. You have to read your Bible. You have to do your chores. The house has to be clean to my standards. And then after 8 o'clock, the TV can be on. Every once in a while, we'll break the rule, right? Maybe the house isn't clean. Maybe it's 7 o'clock, whatever. But when we're watching TV and maybe we're watching a sporting event or something like that, and the commercials come on or whatever, and a scantily clad woman comes across the television screen, I say, Josh, look away. And we both look away. That's a practice that we do in my house. And by the way, you have to do it a lot. When you watch television, there's so many scantily clad women, you have to look away. Now, I don't want to do that in the church. It is not right for a believer to have to walk into church and look away. And yet, I've had to do that at times. Now, I won't make a big deal about how people dress. That is, we don't have a dress code. And I'm not going to be one of those guys that say, women shouldn't wear this type of clothing or that type of clothing, or men should wear this or that. I don't do that. All right? I don't even really believe that, okay? But I do believe in modesty. The Bible makes it abundantly clear that women, men as well, women need to dress modestly. We don't have a dress code. We won't as long as I'm the pastor. All right. But if a woman is dressing immodestly, I may have to say something. And I've had to do that in the past a couple times. And interestingly enough, or I should say not surprisingly, it never went well. Not one time. There have been times where I've talked to young people and or the parents, and it didn't go well. There were times where adults needed to be dealt with, and it was like, you know what, I don't feel comfortable dealing with this, and so I would ask maybe another lady, to deal with it, and it didn't go well. I asked my wife or somebody to take care. Didn't go well. People don't like being told what to do. We don't like, quote unquote, giving up our rights for anything. That's part of, unfortunately, the American character. But here are some practical suggestions about modesty. Okay, women should not be wearing these are. But by the way, this is not chapter and verse. This is not like the Bible. These are practical suggestions that I'm offering, not Bible, that are based on scriptural principles. Okay, are you understanding that? So I'm not saying, thus saith the Lord on this, but here are some practical suggestions. Women should not be wearing skin-tight jeans to worship, all right, or yoga pants to worship. Well, why? Because I can see everything. What's the point? What's the point? I see the whole shape. Men can see the whole shape. My recommendation is do not wear skin-tight clothing to worship. They should not be wearing short skirts. Okay, now I'm not going to give you a line to draw on. Okay, it's traditionally thought that somewhere around the knee is in our culture, somewhere around the knee is modest. They should not be exposing their breasts at worship, at church, anywhere for that matter. A woman's beauty should be seen in her character, not her body. Can I get a witness to that, by the way? Is anybody with me here? Again, Paul would have little concept of the immodesty of our day. My guess is that he'd be shocked at how a lot of women dress today. Go to the Middle East and things are entirely different. As you know, I was in the Middle East for 2 weeks. And during those 2 weeks, things were different over there. Women dressed modestly. You would walk down the street and you didn't see body parts. You saw, they were very, very modest. Everyone wore long skirts. They covered their tops up. And when I got back to the United States, it was culture shock. It was like only 2 weeks in a modest culture. I come back here and I'm just like, what? I didn't realize how bad women dress. I knew they were bad. I knew American women dress bad. But I didn't realize how bad it was. I suppose I didn't realize that it could be good in our day. And when I saw what was good, and I came back here, I think it was Joe who prayed, light shines in the midst of the greatest darkness, right? Something like that you prayed. That was evident to me when I came back from the Middle East. I didn't realize how scantily clad American women were. Again, it didn't stand out as much until I had gone to a place where they dressed more modestly. I didn't realize how little clothing was worn here or how tight the clothing was that was worn here. And I found myself being in a spot where it was like I had to watch my eyes. In the Middle East, I didn't have to watch my eyes. I could just go about my life, and it was awesome. And I could just have, I could have falafel and hummus every day, and what's the thing with the chicken and the wrap? What's that called? What's that? Shawarma. I could have chicken shawarma all I want, and then I come back here and everyone's naked, and I'm like finding myself like going into stores and just kind of like having to shield myself. I had a whole different concept of modesty and immodesty. Now, Paul isn't saying that women should look ugly and homely when it comes to worship. He's not telling women to be out of style. He's telling them that they should contribute to, and this is the key idea, that they should contribute to the purity of the church. Women should contribute to the purity of the church. That is, don't dress in a way that induces people to lust after you. Don't dress in a way that calls for people to lust after you. Protect your brother's purity. Don't use worship as a chance to build up a vain sense of self-worth or self-value on the basis of your appearance. That is, a worship service is meant to worship the Lord, not for you to display yourself before a congregation of men. Paul wants women to dress, look at verse 9, modestly and discreetly. Now, we just talked about modesty. We'll talk about being discreet. That is, he's calling for women to use good judgment. He's calling for moderation and self-control. Christian women, again, should be attractive in terms of their godliness. That's what should make a woman attractive. Paul continues, I want women to adorn themselves not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly garments. Ancient women could spend some money on their appearance, as the modern woman could. I imagine the modern woman spends a little more money on the average ancient New Testament woman. But in New Testament times, it could be big dollars, and it could be ostentatious, over-the-top dress. To be honest, in our culture, there are some beauty items that are baffling to me. Our culture is definitely privileged and rich. To me, it almost seems sinful. I'm not saying it's sin, again, but it almost seems sinful to pay someone to clip, scrub, file, and paint your toes. Right? Like, that kind of doesn't, I mean, listen, I understand the women in the crowd are going to be like, blasphemy! Right? How dare thee speak against us? You know, like, I understand that that's maybe a shocking revelation to some of you. But to pay someone to clip, file, scrub, and paint your toenails only for it to last 2 weeks, it seems excessive to me. Men, anyone in agreement on this? And I don't know what that costs. I got to think it's like 30 or 40. What's it cost for a pedicure? Anyone know? No one wants to tell because they don't want to admit that they're the ones getting it. It's like 30 or 40 bucks. Is that about right? 30 or 40 bucks? But you can't just get your pedicure done. You got to get the manicure. You got to get a mani and pedi, right? You got to get mani pedi. And that's like what? Like 50, 60, 70 bucks, I got to think? What's this? The husband should do it? Don't talk again the rest of the service. Am I right? 50, 60, 70 bucks. Does that sound in the ballpark? You would think that the toes would cost way more because you got to touch someone's dirty, nasty, smelly feet. But whatever. Again, I know almost every woman in the audience will disagree, but in Paul's day, it would have been excessive for sure. And in other places in the world, it's excessive for sure. Listen, I get it. You're in this culture. And so you don't typically think outside of this culture, right? I'll have conversations with my wife, for instance. She sees it differently a little bit, right? I mean, she's not running around doing, getting a mani-pedi and all this stuff. I think she's had one pedicure her whole life, right? And it was a gift from someone, if I remember. Is that right? Yeah, okay. Good woman right there. She sees it a little differently than I do. I'm not going to condemn her for that, but I am going to try to get her to see my point on this, right? There is an excess that we're used to in our culture, and we're not used to thinking outside of our culture. If we compare our culture to other places in the world, then we can begin to recognize the excesses that we have in this culture a little bit. Paul writes about ostentatious hairstyles in verse 9. Likewise, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly garments. Now, in ancient times, hair was sometimes braided with gold. And that would have been entirely excessive. And that's kind of the idea that Paul is pointing to. Think of the hairstyles of the aristocrats. It would be a way of showing yourself off instead of worshiping the Lord. And the point is that worship is not about you. It's not about your appearance. Now again, don't get me wrong. That doesn't mean you can't look nice. But don't go trying to make yourself the center of attention. And although this is addressed to women, it's also true for men. Paul writes about ostentatious, over-the-top hairstyles. He also writes about ostentatious, over-the-top signs of riches. You'll see he writes about gold or pearls. In Paul's day, gold was highly valuable. Pearls were even more valuable. They were rare and they were sought after in the first century. It's said that Cleopatra had a pearl that was reportedly worth 25 million denarii. Now, who wants to tell us what a denarii is? How much is a denarii? Someone tell me. Go ahead. Oh, you're not allowed to talk again this service. Someone else? A day's wage, right? So, if a day's wage is $100, right? Now, I don't know what a day's. If it's 50, it's half the number I'm going to give you. But if a day's wage is 25 million days of wages, by the way, if a day's wage is $100, that would make that pearl in the modern marketplace worth $2.5 billion. You imagine having a $2.5 billion pearl? If a day's wage is 50, that's one and a quarter. So let's call it between $1.5. I think we could be real super conservative and say $1.5 billion pearl. I'll tell you what I would do with that pearl. I'd sell it. And I would live on the interest. That's what I would do. I wouldn't spend any money. I would work for free, right? I would tithe to the church. I'd work for free. I would donate my money like Donald Trump does. Only president to donate his salary, by the way. Anyway, and I would live off the interest of that money. But Cleopatra wore it around. Paul's gold and pearls is like adorning yourself in diamonds today. That's the general idea. Isaiah spoke against the proud women of Israel. And he spoke of these women who wore their ankle bracelets and jewelry and headbands and necklaces and bracelets and veils and perfumes and rings and nose rings and purses and mirrors and so on. Isaiah 3:16 and following. The women of Isaiah's day were focused on their appearance. They were focused on their own physical beauty, but they were not focusing on worshiping the Lord. And that is vanity. If you're not a godly person, looks are nothing. Paul, back in 1 Timothy 2:9, mentions costly garments. You'll see that there. Costly garments. I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly garments. And the idea is, try to imagine church becoming a show, a display. Several years ago, I saw a wedding on television. It was one of the princes of England. I don't remember which one. Maybe both. I feel like I saw one of them. I don't remember if I saw both of them. But I remember the show. What a show. All the women showed up with their fancy hats and their fancy clothing, right? And all the men had their fancy clothes on, right? Try to imagine church becoming that. James talks about that a little bit. James writes a little bit about that in James chapter 2. He talks about a man showing up in a congregation with rich clothing. By the way, pretty much the only New Testament passage that deals with dress in a local assembly, that deals with clothing in a local assembly. And in that passage, James writes about the church showing favoritism to that man and it being sin. But never says, by the way, that's how we should dress when it comes to church. Sometime back, we had one or two guys who were trying to force me to make a dress code so that everyone had to wear suits. That was a thing. People wanted me to make a dress code so that everyone that did any type of service, sound man, whatever, it doesn't matter, they had to wear suits. But for much of church history, people only had a few outfits. In New Testament times, the poor had only one garment. And you better believe that garment could get pretty dirty because they wouldn't wash those garments for several days. It wasn't until the 1800s when people started dressing up for church, and Baptists condemned those people. Did you know that? The Baptists condemned people for dressing up for church. In fact, some denominations, including the Baptists, turned people away when they showed up in a suit. The Puritans did as well. Turned people away. Things have changed, huh? But you know, people have been dressing up in their quote-unquote Sunday best my whole life, so it must be right. It must be biblical. Can you see the faulty reasoning there, guys? The faulty reasoning. I would not be bullied into adopting some extra biblical dress code. Modesty, on the other hand, that's a different story. There was a time in my life when I thought that a man wasn't spiritual unless he wore a suit and a tie. I was judging spirituality on the basis of my own cultural assumptions, not on the basis of what God said. And I was wrong. I was wrong about that. Now, I will say that I was a product of my environment and my culture. It was a product of what was being shown to me and what was being displayed to me, but it doesn't make it right. I was wrong. Godliness, a suit does not make one godly. In fact, some of the most ungodly people I've ever dealt with in churches have been people who wore suits. If you want more on that, we have a sermon in James 2, Chad, right? James 2, 1 through 13. You probably have it in MP3 format. You could probably email it to people. So see Chad, but stay at least 6 feet away from him, right? And he'll send that to you. Anyway, Paul ridicules women who deck themselves out in order to gain the attention of men. This is not a godly woman. It's a selfish woman. It's a woman who wants men to desire her, and so it's a lustful woman. A woman who is scantily clad or who shows off her body parts. She may not even realize it, but she wants men to desire her, and she finds some sense of satisfaction in men desiring her. Proverbs actually writes about a woman like that. I'd recommend you read the book of Proverbs. Doesn't mean that you can't look nice. Again, I'll say a few more things about that later. So Paul, in verse 9, Paul warns against being excessively focused on appearance. Instead, the godly woman needs to be focused on her character. All right? The godly woman needs to be focused on her character. Now, I'm going to read verses 9 and 10, but I want you to focus kind of on verse 10 as we read it. Likewise, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly garments, but rather by means of good works, as is proper for women making a claim to godliness. And so the godly woman displays her godliness through her actions, not necessarily through her appearance. Proverbs 31:30 says this, "Charm is deceitful, and beauty is vain. But a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised." Paul writes that a godly woman is to adorn herself with good works in verse 10. Her life is a daily sacrifice, pleasing to the Lord. You could see Romans 12, 1 and 2 for that principle. She's not conformed to this world. And by the way, many women are very much conformed to this world. They will see this world act a certain way and dress a certain way, and they will copy that. The godly woman is not conformed to this world. Instead, she is transformed by the renewing of her mind. This is a woman who is countercultural to a certain extent. She loves God and loves His Word, and her life is transformed by Jesus Christ. She knows what it means to be a servant. She knows what it means to sacrifice for those around her. She's not, listen to this, she's not loud, boisterous, and in charge. That's those things, the world likes that today. The loud woman who's in charge. She's not loud, boisterous, and in charge. She doesn't have to give her opinion all the time about everything. She doesn't have to argue her point. She's not the opinionated Facebook woman who rants. By the way, people who rant on Facebook but don't say things to your face are cowards. Nothing but a bunch of cowards, because they can hide behind their computer in a non-face-to-face confrontation and spew out all types of garbage. Cowards. Most of the people on Facebook that I've been reading are cowards. Cowards. The godly woman understands the value of a humble and submissive spirit, and this is how she acts in the assembled body of the church. This is, look at the end of verse 10. This is proper for women making a claim to godliness. A godly woman understands these things. In fact, you can identify a godly woman quite easily in a church. And you can identify those who merely claim to be godly women. Godly women are students of the Word of God. They aren't know-it-alls. They're able to be taught. I find that many people in our society, not just women in particular, women and men, are unteachable. They are their own experts. They're their own heart surgeon. And they're hard to teach. And they will challenge you on everything, no matter how biblical it is. A godly woman's not a know-it-all. She's able to be taught. She isn't loud and boisterous. She's humble and submissive. She's reverent and of sound mind. She doesn't try to gain all the attention during worship. She focuses her attention on worship. So rather than receiving the attention, she is giving the attention to the Lord. The Apostle Peter offers some words about this in 1 Peter 3, verses 3 through 4. I'll read it. You could turn there if you like. 1 Peter 3, 3 through 4. Your adornment, that's like, think of like adorning yourself, like clothing yourself, how you're appearing, right? How you're decking yourself out. Your adornment must not be merely external. Braiding the hair and wearing gold jewelry or putting on dresses. But, so we have contrast. It's not merely external. It's not just about your external appearance. So the idea is, it's not that external appearance is completely unimportant, right? I'll say some more about this in a few. I shouldn't just let myself go. I shouldn't make myself look ugly, right? But my adornment, let it be the hidden person of the heart and the world won't like this at all, with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. Gentle and quiet spirit. A gentle and quiet spirit is extremely attractive to a godly man. Now, let me offer some more practical advice to the men in the audience. Men, listen up. Especially those men who are of dating age or who are single or, whatever. When it comes to relationships, by the way, this applies to married men too. When it comes to relationships, looks matter to a certain extent, but godliness matters more. Godliness matters more. Yes, I need to be somewhat attracted to the person I marry, right? I'm not going to marry someone who I can't even fathom kissing, right? I'm going to have to kiss that person quite a bit over the years. And so if I can't even fathom putting my lips against their lips, maybe might not be the one you want to marry, right? Although I would say that when you get to know a person and you get to know their godliness, their looks might just change in your eyes a little bit. They might become more attractive to you. But anyway, so I need to be somewhat attracted to the person I'm going to marry, but I need to be more attracted to her character, to her godliness. That is the top of the list. For me, faithfulness was right up there. Faithfulness to God, faithfulness to me. Those were that's what I was looking for. I wasn't sure where my wife and I stood 20 some years ago. Broke things off for a couple months, and I saw her faithfulness to God, and it changed my whole thinking. Because I was kind of worried that her faithfulness to God was dependent on me. I thought she was faithful to God because I was faithful to God. And when I started seeing that she was faithful to God even without me, it was like, who's that woman? Wow, I like her. She looks good, and she's faithful to God, and I trust her. She's going to be faithful to me. A person's looks are directly affected by their character. I've known women that people said were pretty. And perhaps I initially thought were pretty. But once I got to know her character, her face became associated with ugliness. That is, when I see her face, I see ugliness today. I see the ugliness of her soul. I see the rage, the anger, the tearing down, the belittling. And if I were to look up a picture of ugly in the dictionary, I would expect to see her face there. That's kind of how it really became like worse than dog ugly to me. And some of you might see this woman say, she's beautiful. My wife says, she's really pretty. And I said, no, are you kidding me? Because I see her soul, because I see what she is inside. A person's looks are directly affected by their character. Why? Their character defines their looks to a certain extent. If there's someone who's sweet and godly and serving, has good character, faithful, these things start to become attractive. You start to appreciate an inner quality that affects the way you see the outward shell. Proverbs 11:22 says this, as a ring of gold and a swine's snout, as a ring of gold and a pig's nose, right? You ever see a ring of gold and a pig's nose? I haven't. You ever watch pigs? You ever watch pigs eat? Oh man, it's disgusting. They're disgusting. They taste delicious, by the way. It tastes delicious. I love a good pig. I love a good pig roast. One of my favorite foods, behind maybe filet mignon. I love a good pig. But they're disgusting animals, filthy, disgusting animals. Roll around in mud, and they sit there and they're screaming at each other while they're fighting each other for slop. Put a ring in a pig's snout, right? It tarnishes the ring, right? It kind of, what are you going to have? You're going to have a muddy mess on it. As a ring of gold in a swine's snout, so is a beautiful woman who lacks discretion. Proverbs 11:22. Character and godliness are more important than looks. You got that? Men and women. Now, men are visual, generally speaking. I'm a visual person. I'm the kind of guy who likes the lights on, okay? Like to see who I'm kissing. But men, you need to realize that looks fade. When you're 70 years old, when you're 70 years old, you don't want to be with a woman who is outwardly beautiful in her 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, but she's a mean, nasty, boisterous, contentious, and ungodly person on the inside. You don't want that. You don't want it. Now, those were some practical suggestions for the men. Let me give a few more practical suggestions for the ladies again. Ladies, when it comes to your looks, I would say this. Don't be homely. Don't be a homely woman. You know what I mean when I say that? Like, don't refuse to take care of your appearance in some, false sense of spirituality, right? If I don't put on any makeup, if I don't do anything, if I don't dress nice, that means I'm spiritual. Don't refuse to take care of your appearance. Don't let yourself become plain and avoid any sort of outward beauty. It's not a bad thing to look nice. It's a good thing. It's not a bad thing to look nice for your husband. It's a good thing. Be appealing to, my view is this. Ask my wife. I do my hair every day. Every day. I don't let my wife see me without my hair done. I mean, with rare exception. Would you generally agree with that? Rare exception, you see me without my hair done. Rare exception. And when my hair is not done, usually I throw a hat on. Right? Why? Most people, they want to get dressed up for everyone else. And they don't usually care about what their spouse thinks. I care more about what my spouse thinks than what you guys think. I want to look good for her more than I want to look good for you. Women, be appealing to your husband. Be desirable. Wear makeup. Do your hair. Put on a nice dress. Give him the works. All right? At home. Make it so that he can't wait to come home and see you. Make it so that he can't resist you. But don't bring immodesty to worship. Don't make your appearance the focus of your worship time. You can still look nice. Don't be excessive. Don't be ostentatious. Don't make worship about you. Don't neglect godliness. And don't let your appearance define who you are. Let your character define who you are. Your godliness define who you are. Now, if you're a single woman, character comes first. But again, don't neglect your appearance altogether. Make yourself look nice. Don't expose your body. If you are attracting men with your body, then you are attracting the wrong guy. I've said, you want to attract men with your eyes, not your thighs, right? Attract men by your character and your godliness. Expose godly character. Paul makes it clear in this passage that godliness is more important than looks. I understand that there was a lot of practical suggestions in this message. Don't confuse the practical things for what God is clearly saying, all right? And sometimes that'll happen in a message. But understand that the practical suggestions I'm offering are a serious attempt to apply what I see in God's Word. Maybe not perfect. Maybe, certainly not God-breathed, those applications. But nevertheless, a very serious attempt to apply what God has written. Paul makes it clear that godliness is more important than looks. And so, ladies, you can still work on your appearance. You can still pretty yourselves up a bit. Just don't let it become the focus of your worship. And more than that, be sure to develop and to continue developing godly character in your life and wear that godliness as we worship the Lord together. I'm going to have Brother Paul come forward to lead us in a closing song. I'm going to say before you shut that off and before we sing, you can't be godly if you don't know Jesus Christ. You can't have godly character if you don't have Jesus Christ. If you're not saved, you can be nice and you could be humble and you could be some of those, but you can't have Christ likeness because you don't have Christ. And so I would encourage you, if you're listening to this or if you're listening to this online, if you're not sure you're saved, then reach out to me and come see me, and I'd be happy to share with you the gospel that we're sinners, we're separated from God, we cannot save ourselves because of the penalty of our sins. That's why Jesus Christ came. And we as believers, we need to stop trusting in our own self and our own good works. We need to place our faith in the completed work of Christ on the cross. I have to trust Jesus Christ for eternal life. And when I do that, I can start the path to godliness. You're here in this room, in this audience, and you know you're saved, but you've struggled a little bit over your image, over your appearance, and maybe this is the time where you kind of come to a point of repentance. Say, I want to focus. I'm not going to neglect my appearance, but I do want to refocus on godliness. If that's you, then while we sing, you just pray to God. Look up into the heavens and see God and pray to Him. I mean, you can't see. No man can see God anytime, right? But look up to the heavens and pray to God and ask Him to forgive you and repent. Brother Paul.